first time doing this, so we have no way of knowing if people can see right now.
I think people can see. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Justin Charles. I have with me my comrade Simone Norman and Mike Davis. First, going to talk a little bit about what Emerge is, and then we'll get into our discussion. Mike. So if you don't know, Emerge is a caucus of NYC DSA specific to New York City, coalesced under the banner of communism. And for us, that means socialism is the ongoing work of self-emancipation, more than a slate of state policies or programs, and more than merely a redistributive project. As organizers must make socialism identical with the experiences of solidarity, collective action, and the ability to have direct power over our own lives. B, we believe political power for our movements has mass self-organization as its basis. It's measured by the ability of the working class to fight to determine the conditions of our own lives. We believe in the strategic importance of elections. But we also believe that political power means more than how many socialists we might elect to office. That power lies in the organizations, institutions that we build, making that world possible. In a time characterized by working class disunity and division, we believe the starting point for social strategy is to recognize that struggle may be categorized by particular or specific demands, such as for abolition of ICE, defense against police terror. And we know that the working class is divided along lines including race, geography, vocation, gender, disability, home ownership, citizenship status, formal education background, etc. So class struggle breaks out in many directions with many demands, rarely all together all at once. While these struggles themselves have independent vitality and validity, their aspirations of many will only be achievable if we build a mass base that unites these emerging struggles, and that's where our name comes from. Some of what we've been involved in, I can say, are building power for a red radio station here in New York City through WBAI, fighting for abolition through campaigns like Free Them All for Public Health, and now the Defund NYPD campaign, augmenting the work of our rank and file strategy in New York City through organizing the unorganized. And now I'll hand it off to Simone to talk a little bit about how you might get involved in Emerge.
Hey everybody, thanks Justin, and thank you to Comrade Mike for being here. You can go to our website, first of all, to get involved. We're dsaemerge.org. You can check out our points of unity there. Those are the principles that we all come and center in our work, and we may vary in specific labels and tendencies on the left, but at the end of the day, there are these points of unity that bring us all together, that we organize around, and you can read those on our website. And ultimately it's about building we all share this horizon for this communist horizon. We have the same vision for what that could and should look like, and we're building towards that every day. We are a New York City caucus of the DSA, so you do have to be here to be a member, but you can keep up with us we do political education events like this. This is our first big one, but we do events like this, and we do reading groups, and we put out, we write together and we put out things, and it's all on our website. So we also have a Facebook and a Instagram and a Twitter, and I think it's like DSA Emerge. That's the name on all the platforms. So without further ado, incredible professor, author, and revolutionary thinker and leader, Justin is going to introduce Mike Davis and start asking him some questions, and yeah, we're really excited to have you.
So thanks so much for joining us, Mike. First thing I wanted to ask was just kind of about the current moment. Over the past few weeks, and months. We've seen tremendous creativity, bravery, and energy in the streets all over the country, and solidarity across the globe as well. The current moment is a period of turmoil that might be considered a bit of an omni-crisis, in that we're on the brink of an economic recession, in the midst of a global pandemic, a few months shy of the presidential election, a pretty big one, and now in the midst of one of the most powerful rebellions against police violence this country has seen since at least 1967. How do you think these elements have come together to produce this moment, and what are just some of your observations about what's been going on as of late?
I think the general material conditions since the 2008 recession inflicted such massive damage on working class families and communities, particularly people of color. Many studies have shown that a big part of the net assets, the net worth of, for instance, Black and Latino families, evaporated in a 6-month period. But the social conditions, I think, are really two things. First is the decline of any kind of reasonable economic mobility for college graduates in particular, and specifically for the first generation kids whose parents immigrated from Mexico, or the first African American family on the block to have somebody in college. I've been teaching these kids for a long time, and they come to school, they bear a kind of enormous moral expectation that they have to succeed because their families have sacrificed to send them to college. And then they find themselves lost, not knowing where to turn, looking at a future in Starbucks or working for Uber. And then secondly, has been the relentless campaign to roll back the achievements of the civil rights era, and not only to do this, informally, but a legal offensive that has stripped away rights people thought they had won permanently. And then, of course, the attack on, immigrants. So these two factors together are deeply radicalized, I think, or at least made susceptible to radicalization a large part of the younger generation. I think that police violence always tends to play the role of a catalyst. But what distinguishes this from other periods is that for young people who've previously had seemingly bountiful opportunities to achieve the incomes of their parents or go beyond. I mean, only 20 years ago, there was the euphoria where every Ivy League graduate could become a millionaire and euro Wall Street. That's a totally different world from the one we live in. And now, of course, we're faced with mass immiseration. A large share of the jobs have been lost, will never return. Family-owned businesses will close forever to the delight of Jeff Bezos and the super monopoly that Amazon has become. And already we're facing a large-scale hunger crisis in this country. I mean, it's like ordinary Americans went to sleep one night in February and then woke up the next morning to find out that we're living in 1933. I think in some other countries, the coronavirus crisis will be instrumentalized in support of the far right. But we have opportunities now to build the socialist movement on a scale that was inconceivable, even in the Debsian period. But of course, what's lacking in some ways is how do you achieve a continuity of goals, archive experience, and work in different battlefronts and communities at the same time? And decentralized organizations and the whole style of organizing today has been incredibly successful in reacting almost immediately to outrages and in defense of people, and has a large mass base, far more democratic than anything I ever participated in the 1960s. But I believe that the historical problem remains that to weave these movements and protests together, to create a political consciousness that synthesizes all the different demands, you still need an organization of organizers. You might call that Leninism, but if Lenin never existed, that problem was right there staring at socialists at the turn of the 20th century. It remains there today. Obviously, we need to build something that's different from what came out of the 1960s, particularly in the white left, authoritarian and democratic organizations, a kind of cult of Stalinism that I still don't understand where that came from. But the landscape of opportunity to bring movements together and build a mass movement for socialism in this country is there. But the question is, are any of the current organizations or the tendencies within them capable of beginning to take the next step?
Thank you so much. That was a great first answer to a really important first question. So, Mike, you've written about the Watts Rebellion and the Rodney King riots with a lot of depth. How does the recent movement, which roared into national consciousness with riots across the country, compare to some of those earlier moments of urban insurrection, would you say?
Well, 65 and 92 were actually, I mean, they may look similar because in each case the instigation was police violence. But they're actually very different. In 1965, the California economy was booming. I'd just gotten out of high school. And if you could avoid the draft, a white working class kid could basically choose what he wanted or she wanted to be in the next morning. He wanted a job in an auto factory, as a truck driver. It was a full employment economy that gave massive mobility to many people. In South Central LA, unemployment was increasing. Black youth were totally locked out of the boom. So many had become unemployable because the police literally, consciously arrested people in order to make them essentially unemployable. At the same time, Los Angeles had had a major attempt to transfer the methodology of nonviolent protest, the Southern model, to the city. It had a broad united civil rights committee energized by activists in Congress of Racial Equality. And they mounted a citywide movement in 1963. with demands on all fronts for jobs, integrated schools, desegregating suburban housing, and so on. And although they had a summit meeting with the ruling class of LA, nothing came out of it. And instead, you begin to see massive white resistance. And the next year, in 1964, 2/3 of the voters, white voters in California, voted to repeal the state's new Fair Housing Act. So here you have the defeat of peaceful reform, the persistence of structural unemployment amidst a boom, the growth of white backlash in even white democratic areas of California. And that set the course for what happened. And then you had an event which really was never reported in the mainstream media at all, but extensively covered in the black press by the two daily African-American papers, of a young woman who was abducted and raped by a couple of cops, and then later died under mysterious circumstances. And white Los Angeles was totally unaware of this, but this was, believe me, on the minds of everybody else. And then on a hot summer night, in an ordinary traffic stop by the Highway Patrol, white LAPD weighed in, attacked a woman, and started beating people in the crowd. And you have universal, rebellion. And the product of the rebellion is a kind of cultural elation and celebration for standing up against power and against the police, followed by the Watts Renaissance and the creation of a new, more radical Black United Front called the Black Congress. That was 65. In 1992, the majority of people arrested were not Black. They weren't arrested in what was conventionally considered South Central LA. It was a far more complex event. Southern California was at the epicenter of a national recession. Homelessness was exploding. I once pointed out that I thought the most important picture from the 1992 uprising was actually taken the Christmas before, a photograph of 8,000 or 10,000 mainly Latino women and children waiting hours in the cold to get a free chicken and a toy. LA hadn't seen pictures like that since 1938. And then within the African American community, plant closures have been devastating. And then you had this policy of mass criminalization of black youth, stopped indiscriminately, branded with gang tags. And of course, this was a seething volcano of anger. So what happened in 1992 was something like a combination of a bread riot and an uprising against the police. And also, there was tremendous inter-ethnic enmity after a Korean chaperone simply murdered a 14 or 15-year-old Black girl. It's also geographically more complex. In the working class Latino city of Huntington Park, Mexican kids burned down Cuban businesses. In Compton, Black kids burnt down shopping centers owned by wealthy Black investors who lived outside of Compton. 65 got tremendous amount of attention. There was an official riot report, which was then thoroughly debunked and rebuked by numerous other cities. And there's, a wide debate about it. 92 was simply covered up. Didn't want to understand what was happening. And instead was frozen in these stereotypes usually taken by helicopter so-called gang youth burning down the city. That's not what happened at all. What we're seeing today, I think, is something quite different. And one aspect of it that I think has been particularly overlooked, the press goes on endlessly about the large white participation in the protests. I still have 2 kids in high school. My younger kids are Mexican. They go to Union City High School. And what's extraordinary to me is all the kids of color band together. The Filipinos, some Filipinos, the Samoans, the Somali kids, the Black kids, the Latino kids, and the fastest growing group in California, which are people who have at least 2 different racial, ethnic, identities. And this has been particularly thrilling for me to see. And the imagery I've seen, the protests in other cities, bear that out. Somebody asked me a question the other day, and really the idea of people of color become obsolete. And really, Black youth were protesting for themselves. That's not true. It really, it really isn't. I mean, you see the fusion together of the kind of economically doomed generation that's standing up to fight for equality and others, and a real, I think, profound kind of solidarity between groups of youth. Also, this movement, see, in 92 and earlier in 65, and in most of the urban uprisings in the country, the police were able to barricade the community so that the wealthy white areas were never affected by it. This movement is everywhere. And that's extraordinary. And it's taken root in places with populations of 1,200 people, little towns in the Midwest to Rocky Mountains. It's not just a bi-coastal movement, it's a truly national movement, which is sinking roots all across the country. And that creates whole new possibilities. Years ago, I wrote something about that the real destiny of the Occupy movement was the fact that it was popping up all over the country. And my wife and I became active in a little group out in the Imperial Valley, 120 miles east of where we live. Just a group of kids, a couple of older people. Occupy El Centro was their slogan. Unfortunately, the diffusion of the movement and the embryonic groups across the country were never given much support and eventually petered out. But this is something quite different, and again, I think, unprecedented, at least since the time of industrial unionism in the 1930s. So I suppose you could say the civil rights movement, sure, also.
Thanks for that, Mike. That made me think of, because you talked about Occupy and the history of, past rebellions. And you talked in our first question, in response to our first question, about the need for organization. I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on the space that these rebellions create for long-term organization, and what experiences we should keep in mind as we kind of gear up for a new phase of political work and trying to carry this energy forward in a way that builds up our capacity as a movement.
Well, first, let me point out something that is kind of a major thesis of the book I published with John Wiener, Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s. And it turns out that the single largest social base for activism went to big universities. They were the high schools and even the junior high schools. Black, Latino, and sympathetic white high school students created a general strike in Los Angeles. And there were also the students on inner city community colleges and so on. And because I'm so parochial and have only California examples to share, we've seen this again and again. The high schools were blown out in protests against Governor Pete Wilson's invidious initiative to force undocumented kids out of the school. They're blown out in huge protests. If I were a TSA member right now, I'd be arguing very strongly for the creation of a national high school organization. And I've, again, been drawing from family example here. I've been put in a very awkward situation. I cannot convince my younger kids or any of their friends on the necessity of casting a vote for Joe Biden. They just laughed it off. They want deep, radical change. And this isn't just a handful of kids from families with old commies in it, like me. These are kids from working class immigrant black families. They're enormously aware. Their ethical attitudes are so advanced, so intolerant of any form of bigotry or racism, but above all, they won't accept anything less than profound change. And because of the material conditions of their lives, this won't evaporate when they go to college or after they graduate from college, as so often happened in the 60s. They're going to be contending with crisis for the rest of their lives. By the way, I have to say I was critical of Occupy because I thought the 1% was ridiculous. Anybody who knows American history or has ever hitchhiked around the country or been a long-distance truck driver will tell you that at least 30% of America has been proto-fascist forever. And that is a huge mistake not to understand how deeply reactionary so much of the petty bourgeoisie in middle strata is in so many parts of the country. It shouldn't be any surprise they love Donald Trump.
One thing I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on, so, in the past you've referred to Black liberation as like the historical dynamo, the catalyst for class struggle in this country. How would you frame the relationship between Black struggle and the broader currents of class struggle today? And what do you think that means, for communist strategy?
Well, there's this ancient debate about American exceptionalism. And one of the most prominent positions taken by Seymour Lipset, the sociologist Seymour Lipset and others, is that the American working class, and this is debate, why is there not socialism there, or why isn't there at least a labor party? And their position is that the American working class was structurally de-radicalized by the early victory for white manhood suffrage in the United States. Now, part of their explanation for this is true, that everywhere in Europe, workers had to fight not only for unions, but for suffrage, and often against autocracy and monarchy. And the convergence of these two movements and struggles was indeed very radicalizing. But what this school of thought ignores is essentially saying that there are no major democratic tasks to be solved in the United States. And of course, I mean, this is a country that, till I was in middle age almost, still disenfranchised a large part of its population. So in American history, there really have been two engines producing the kind of struggles that might lead to class consciousness. The most important of these, in some ways, is the struggle for Black liberation and for power and equal rights for immigrants and minorities in general. Because, of course, the legacy of the movement of the 60s, the African American movement, it made possible, hugely important reforms for women, for other groups, even the handicapped. All of them grew off the example provided, or the successes that occurred legislatively in Washington. Then on the other side is the struggle to organize, which is always in the 19th century and the early 20th century was again and again disorganized by nativist backlash against the immigrant workers who formed the semi-skilled working class in the steel mills and on the assembly line. But the great strategic question is, how do you put these two things together? The revolutionary democratic component, the unionization, economic component. Debs was very advanced when he took a position, of which he was a small minority in the Socialist Party, of embracing industrial unionism, which caused an uproar since craft unionists were the majority of the labor people inside the old Socialist Party. Black rights were hardly mentioned at all. The great achievement of the Communist Party from the 1920s on, for all of its other sins, is to develop a strategic vision that understood that Black workers were actually, because they had, in a sense, this double sense of grievances and double set of issues, to play a leading role, a vanguard role in industrial organization and economic struggles, but they also understood that you never successfully build class unity unless you took race head on and fought militantly and unconditionally for equality, at the workplace. Now, there's so many other dimensions to the struggles that occurred in the urban political arena about housing and so on. And in a sense, the American left has been trying to figure out how to make this combination work. Now, in the 60s, there were two instances where it seemed that a real breakthrough was happening. First was the Black Panther Party, which by 1969, making great progress in organizing young Black workers, veterans returning from Vietnam, working in auto plant assembly lines in the Bay Area, or a group of people I work with, young vets working at the major post office in LA, who just joined the Black Panther Party, who were really interested in Marxism. And there were people in the party who understood that. But right at the moment when the Panthers had the potential to become a mass party and a more workplace-based party, the FBI succeeded in instigating the internal conflicts between party elites that ultimately destroyed the party. by far the most advanced example of the left in the whole period, and the organization that in some ways really was a paradigm, was, of course, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the various affiliated movements in the different auto plants. I've always thought it was the kind of organization and political high point of that period. Now, it was organized in a transitional period when the big American auto companies were facing increasing competition from European and Japanese car makers. And instead of altering the organization work and beginning to capture workers' brains and creativity and ideas as Toyota did, the big three simply increased the speed of the assembly lines to a level that was actually breaking people. It was just relentless. Anybody who's ever seen the movie Blue Collar will see that at hand. And particularly young black workers introduced in the plant faced this terrible regime of, speed up safety, of a grievance procedure that wouldn't listen to workers whose skin was black. And that gave an incredibly important impetus to the growth of the movement. But what none of us had foreseen, the organizers in Detroit had foreseen, of course, was that eventually the response to international competition would be the globalization of production. Actually beginning, first of all, with increasing resort to the American South as a non-union labor market, and an increase in manufacturing investment there, then to Mexico, and then to East Asia. So you had these two big waves of deindustrialization at the end of the 1970s and at the end of the 80s. In Los Angeles, Black and Latino workers, militant workers, had just made big advances in the previous 5 years, in the early 70s, in opening up, more skilled, better jobs in the plants, but also had begun to take over, essentially, some of the major locals. These were incredible power bases for organizing the community. I mean, maybe the most famous example is the role of the longshoremen in San Francisco. They're actually a small union, but, have been the motor behind protest movements in, the Bay Area for, some 80 years or more. Well, that was happening in LA and other cities who radicalized young workers, particularly of color, as they begin to assume leadership and gain this power in the factories, immensely increased the resources available to people organizing on the community level in a whole, array of issues. And of course, deindustrialization drove a silver stake through the heart of that dream.
Thank you. Wow. I think that kind of naturally brings us more to, I want to ask one more question regarding this organizational issue for us in DSA and on the left broadly. We like to work with coalitions, and there's an appreciation for united fronts and these intergroup collaborations that we've noticed shines through in your writing on the U.S. left. And so would love it if you could talk about what you think coalition work really entails right now for an organization like ours. And we're a caucus, within a national a caucus within a chapter within a national organization. So, there's a lot there. There can be, there's a lot of experimentation that can be done. There's rank and file entryism, there's new shop floor organizing campaigns, electoral races, mutual aid work. We're putting pressure on local elected officials. There's rent strike organizing. There's so much, and it can be really hard to work in coalition, with different groups. So, what is your view on the place of a socialist political organizing in the broader working class left fronts and its ecosystems?
Well, first of all, we've seen some very successful examples, not of the United Front. Its essential idea is unifying workers of different political persuasions from below in common struggles against the bosses or fascism. But a popular front, which has had amazing success in some ways inside the Democratic Party, but has ended up, as many Michaels wrote a famous book studying what had happened in the breakthrough election at the beginning of the century. Suddenly, the socialists who'd been, for many years, an illegal underground party in Germany, suddenly had become the second largest party in the Reichstag and had hundreds of municipal sinecures. And, the unions created more and more bureaucratic jobs. And he describes in rather incredible detail what has happened again and again. So I guess I'm raising 2 points. It's important to go back and look at debates about United Front, Popular Front. It's above all crucial to analyze what happened with the Sanders campaign. But above all, we need to be wary of the temptations that and the institutional activities that can turn the most revolutionary organizer into a fat trade union bureaucrat or a big city council person, constantly making excuses why none of the things she was elected on can actually be happening because of the budget crisis, so on and so on. And of course, we have some models for that. I mean, so far, AOC is the best thing going on that score. But we can't count on individuals alone. We need consistent principles and a strategy focused on creating rank and file leadership on the streets and at the point of production, and creating some vehicle that allows people nationally to work in coordination, prepared to meet what I think will soon be seen. I mean, all the activism since 2008 has gone up in a time of course, endless police violence. But on the whole, in a period where people really haven't had to face state repression as it existed several decades before, we're going to face state repression on a scale that it's almost too terrifying to think about. Because with a large minority of workers basically pushed out of the economy and pauperized, people's protests will become more radical, more sustained, and who knows what the surveillance state and artificial intelligence and Google and can throw at us. We need to be thinking about these things and need to recognize that forms of organization are in some ways not eternal principles. They're adapted to the conditions, and conditions in which very decentralized organizations built upon, grassroots initiatives and single-issue campaigns are one thing. But in a period of repression, in a period that needs better coordinated struggles on a whole front of issues, you need a different kind of organization. And that's why the communist experience, Leninism, Trotskyism, or whatever variety are most sympathetic to, remains so essential to us. Although, of course, we're all, I think, pretty conscientious about the problems in making analogies to events 100 years ago. But this, I once actually said, I've read the collected works of Lenin, and I'm amazed how much of it still is relevant.
So I want to return to peacing for a bit and talk about how this rebellion, how it uprose because of abuse of police power, police brutality, etc. And it's been focused on police power. And, in New York and elsewhere, the focus on defunding the police budgets has been central. But I want to talk about your understanding, kind of bringing in part bringing into being the idea of the concept of the prison industrial complex. What does that mean? What is the militant organizing context that term arises from? And what purpose, what political function does the concept of the prison industrial complex serve? And how we might continue this kind of anti-police and anti-state violence current and anti-prison current in the socialist project? Why is part of the socialist project and not some fringe concern?
I'm trying to remember my favorite quote from Trotsky. He was writing about the police in Berlin and in Prussia, and they were all social democrats. Like the social democrats who were governing in that period had recruited politically conscious workers to the police force. And these same politically conscious social democratic cops in a May Day riot in 1929 killed hundreds of left-wing workers. So Trotsky writes that a worker in a police uniform is no longer a worker, period, which is a straightforward and simple principle, one we should never forget. I mean, what's extraordinary about these protests, apart from their composition and dynamic, is actually creating a national debate about abolishing or recreating the police in a new form. I think that's a tremendous victory to put that in the realm of ordinary politics. But who are the police? One of the great problems in the 60s was that the police, because of their relentless attacks on movements and organization, became the main issue and made it very difficult to focus struggles against the people who really ruled American cities, against the banks and newspapers and so on. And also, of course, the police are merely the mailed fist. Who gives the police orders? we established the laws that send people to prison for life for two relatively minor, felonies. So obviously we need to begin talking about the entire criminal justice complex, from the prison systems down to the cop on the beat. Because at the end of the day, it's really irrational just to focus on abolishing or changing the police. We need to be equally or even more concerned about the judges and the DAs and the suburban legislators every time they run for office, try and stoke support with some dreadful new enhancements to punishment, usually with a racial message. But we can't let the police issue occupy the stage so completely. I'm very confident that the movement will broaden into a full-scale movement about criminal justice. But this again, we're talking about a reform goal and a reform program in a time where we're still thinking like all of these great reforms are possible. A second New Deal, a Green New Deal, and all that. But we also know that Biden comes to power, we'll return to a status quo. And it's unlikely that any of the big reforms will succeed. That's why we can't leave the streets. Now, how do you join other incredibly important protests, like defending the rights of workers in essential industries, of defending communities from mass eviction and loss of their homes and so on? How do you coordinate these right now without diminishing attention to the BLM struggle? And I must admit, this is a complex and not an easy question. I've been concerned that in so much of the coverage, Latinos have been ignored, including Black Latinos, Puerto Ricans. In the Southwest, Mexicans were lynched, were segregated in schools, in housings, and have always been subjects of police violence. So I'm not sure how you keep the specificity and the focus on Black Lives Matter, but at the same time, broaden it to encompass other oppressed people in parts of the working class. Somebody reminded me the other day that actually the majority of people, I mean, of course, Black people are killed with such an awful higher rate than whites. And most people actually killed by the police are poor white people. And there's going to be a lot more poor white people in the country very soon. I mean, the Democrats have abandoned whole sections of the country. I mean, West Virginia was the most democratic state in the country for decades. Now it's a Trump stronghold. How did that happen? Well, the Democratic Party has nothing to say to West Virginians in the mines or steel mills for the last 20 or 25 years. It doesn't seem to know that Appalachia, even exists. It's ignored the plight of people in older Midwest, Western, Southern in industrial cities. I mean, Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition a generation ago was amazing in that regard. It did not actually set out in the beginning to specifically win over white workers. But because Jesse Jackson was talking the old religion that the neoliberal Democrats had abandoned, New Deal religion of full employment, a tremendous response in the industrial Midwest. White workers were desperate, and a lot of people left the racial privileges by the roadside in supporting that. I'm not a pundit able to address these problems, but merely to outline some of them.
Yeah, and I mean, I think another pretty remarkable thing about this movement has been the speed at which it not only ripped through our country here, but traveled abroad. The anti-police riots in Mexico, the struggles across the Caribbean, and clashes between police and migrant workers in France and elsewhere. You've been kind of making the clarion call for more internationalist practices on today's left. So what do you think, what would effective internationalism look like in this context?
Well, let's start with the current crisis. There are really two immunological humanities. In countries like the United States, about a quarter of the population, because of the living conditions of pre-existing health conditions and so on, are liable to severe or even mortal infections from the coronavirus. In countries where malnutrition is rife, where medical systems have broken down and almost non-existent, as in so much of Africa, but also parts of the Middle East and South Asia, 60 to 70% of the population find themselves in that situation. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, majority of people who died from it were actually died in India, not in Western Europe and America, where accounts of the pandemic always focus. It hit India at a time when people were malnourished. The British had deliberately confiscated food surpluses to feed people back home with their armies in the field. And when the Spanish flu hit bodies that were malnourished and immune suppressed, it became a massacre. What I'm saying is that the greatest threat of the pandemic right now is in poor countries and poor cities. Now, I recall that our founders, in the pamphlet they wrote 170, almost 175 years ago, said communists differ from the mainstream of the workers' movement in only two respects. In the movement of the present, they represent the goals of the future. And in the particular geographical movement of the moment, they represent the interests of the working class as a whole. I've always taken these to be the two great Marxist commandments. So the touchstone of internationalism right now is fighting against the touchstone of internationalism, right now, is that we must be the most, militant and constant advocates that drugs that are developed and vaccines, are distributed on a basis of global need. We must oppose tooth and nail the policies of the Trump administration, which has basically been raiding the international market for antivirals and protective devices. Because in Africa and South Asia, this disease is taking a far more terrible form. And in general, we should be conscious that the genocide is an incipient tendency in capitalism today. I mean, I argue to young people that capitalism has become a danger to human survival in 4 ways. It can't create jobs or decent incomes for people. The majority of the working people in cities of Latin America, Africa, South Asia work in an informal economy that's often a euphemism for structural unemployment. Capitalism is no longer a job machine. And there's 1.5, 2 billion people on Earth who are simply surplus and irrelevant to the accumulation of capital on a world scale. Secondly, it's become clear that capitalism cannot decarbonize our economies fast enough, or what's equally important, ensure the transfer of resources, because the countries that create the accumulations are not the ones that feel its most dreadful effects. Agriculture is starting to fail in all parts of the world. And ending carbon emissions in the United States is not enough. The cost of adaptation to climate change are going to be enormous. And because some of the effects will be felt first by wealthy Americans living on seacoasts and insect nodes, they'll want to monopolize all the spending and resources to protect themselves, leaving less behind for poor Americans and nothing for third world. The third thing, of course, is that capitalism is obviously incapable. Put it this way, that the current organization of healthcare is incapable of translating revolutionary advances in biodesign, genetic sequencing, and so on into global public health. The possibilities imminent in these new technologies are extremes, big pharma, and so on. They become an absolute fetter on the development of these forces. I'm sorry, I could go on with this, but I think our duty, our internationalist duty, is not just the one-issue solidarity campaigns that are enormously important, and some of which are really just absolute touchstones in themselves. I mean, support for Palestine is just, if you're a socialist, that's got to be one of the first things you sign on to it. But we need to address the more general threats to human survival that are posed by this decaying and increasingly destructive organization of the world economy. We need a vision that's lacking here. And I think this is something that the people of the revolutionary left need to really start thinking about. In a sense, the only person right now that I see on Earth with a big audience speaking loudly about the unity of the human race and the survival of the poor is the Argentine soccer fan who lives in a big house in Rome. You need socialist voices too.
Thanks for that, Mike. I want to kind of turn back to organizational questions as they relate to DSA going forward, on the left in general in the United States. So DSA has had some tangible successes, especially in New York, getting candidates elected, organizers in our movement, activists in their workplace or neighborhoods, running competitively and not always winning, but competitively. But I think the rebellion in the streets coinciding with, in New York State context at least, some pretty important races for state legislature. I think it kind of shows the ways in which we need to kind of like balance what is emerging movement struggle and our kind of already in place electoral strategy and priorities. And I guess I'm kind of wondering how we're able to kind of not have those things be counterposed, but how do we use them to strengthen one another, I suppose. Or really, I guess, in what ways can we avoid the pitfalls of like the easy, settling into electoralism is kind of like what we do versus like seeing the emerging rebellions and the need to carry that energy forward. How can we bring together these moments and levels of class struggle into comprehensive strategy?
Well, I think any revolutionary organization has to first of all be committed to capturing the energy and representing the interests of young working people. And what is exceptional about the current period is so much of this radicalization and activism is either coming, from young working class people in high schools or, unemployed or working temp jobs, or it's coming from college graduates from minority and immigrant communities. And their life situations are, of course, totally different from that of so many of the cadre of recent revolutionary group. So first of all, it has to consider how do you become a party that mirrors the class you're trying to organize. And this is particularly important in relation to things like electoral strategies and participation in politics, where the political wing becomes stronger than the movement wing, or disorganizes it. If you have an organization full of angry young people who understand that the future is lost unless they transform the system, it's going to be far more effective in controlling the electoral front of struggle and the people that we put in office. I mean, working class today is broader than it was earlier. I mean, you can be actually in the lower ranks of the proletariat, even with a degree in English from City College or something. And young workers of color, women, are, particularly important in the leadership. And this isn't a matter of, kind of, racial equality, a decoration of the group, that it has Black Latino leaders. It's the fact that you need in your leadership not just theorists or people with, good hearts, but little existential understanding of conditions in marginalized communities. You need people who combine profound experience of that with organizational skill. And then, Lenin, in What Is to Be Done, his most misunderstood pamphlet, he wrote that, he said, for his social democrats to recruit young, smart, courageous workers and just leave them in the factory would be a crime. They needed to have conditions under which they could appropriate the important knowledges, formal knowledges that intellectuals had. The party was, in a way, a machine of converting workers into intellectuals and intellectuals into workers. It specifically focused on the priority of recruiting militant young people, but addressing their existential needs. One of my great heroes is a former Black Panther, unfortunately died a few years ago, Michael Zinzin in LA. And in the 70s, at the very bottom of the political recession, activist recession, he built an amazing little collective, which became the single most important group in the country for a long time in fighting apartheid in solidarity with South Africa. And he'd gotten his eye knocked out by the police. They'd gotten some money in a settlement. He set up his own cable TV program. But he also used part of the money to buy some bunk beds and refurbish his garage and stuff, because he knew if he went down and talked, to kids in South Central, or for that matter on the East Side, they had immediate needs. They're hungry, they need somewhere, to sleep. And he essentially built this amazing little ark. And I can't tell you the productivity of that group of ghetto kids in terms of the political work they did and the number of solidarity campaigns that they energized was just extraordinary. But you have to think very deeply about what working people need to maintain a level of activism at the same time they're struggling for a living with family responsibilities. Otherwise, it's, intellectuals and graduates that have some source of independent income. They can easily become full-time activists. But if you're recruiting young workers to become socialist organizers, you have to see it from their standpoint, from the very beginning.
Thank you so much, Mike. So we have time for one more question, and it's one that I'm excited about. Just want to recognize the fact that it's pretty remarkable that some of the leading lights from an earlier cycle of struggle in the U.S. left are still very much with us. People we can turn to for guidance and inspiration, between you, Angela Davis, both who came from the Southern California section of the Communist Party. So can you tell us a bit about what communist organization meant for your tiny slice of the international? What sort of lessons can that organization impart for communist organizers such as ourselves today?
Well, I think one thing we need to understand is the importance of having a citywide program and having the goal of becoming a small mass party that's embedded in all the right places and struggles. The greatest moral and intellectual influence in my life was the leader of the Communist Party in Southern California, Dorothy Healy. We always fought like cats and dogs because, intellectually I'm, inclined toward the international socialists who some variety of the Trotskyist position. And Dorothy considered Trotskyism to be a social disease, essentially. But she had helped build such a small mass party in the 1940s in Los Angeles. And she spent the rest of her life fighting to try and recreate it. I joined the Communist Party with my wife in 1968 out of solidarity with the Southern California branch's condemnation of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and its support for Prague Spring. I joined it because the Communist Party used that there was black leadership, amazing people, like the people who recruited Angela Davis, Kendra and Franklin Alexander. Franklin came out of a whole dynasty of black communists. The father had come out of a sharecropper in Alabama, I think. And I also joined kind of opportunistically because, well, theory, I can go off in a corner and read a book, but I had been a failed organizer in my time in STS. And the party was all about organizing. It was everybody's first and fundamental duty was to organize other people, and try and activate them into, lives of struggle. In a sense, the CP was like the Mormons or something, or the Jehovah's Witnesses, a group I have some affection for, actually. Everything was based on conversion, building organization, and so on. And the amount of experience accumulated by people of the previous generation, of the 20s and 30s generation in the party, was quite incredible. I mean, it was the best trade school that I ever went to. Dorothy, in some ways, has been sentimentalized. And hear people talking about her. She's this wonderful old socialist feminist. She was the Bolshevik to the core. She was the toughest person, intellectually and physically I'd ever met. And this was an experience in a way was kind of unusual because the old left was so irrelevant in most of the country in the 60s. But the party was multi-generational. The youth leadership had started off in civil rights protests in 1960 and 1961. The party had an very open attitude to the new life. And Dorothy had a rather amazing position about some of the more extreme activities that we were attracted to. She'd tell you what was right and what was wrong. But she wouldn't intervene. And her favorite quote was Lenin saying, youth must come to socialism in its own way. And that had been her experience. And that, in a sense, something very rare to hear amongst people who consider themselves to be, senior sages, or a word I particularly don't like, elders. Of course, I'm not the elder of anybody. I mean, emotionally still a teenager, intellectually still a student. I have no wisdom to impart. I want to tell you one last thing. One of the most interesting experiences I ever had, I was invited to speak in Frankfurt, Germany, and in Berlin. And while I was there, these people from the education department of IG Metall, the largest industrial union in the world, metal workers, auto workers, steel workers, and so on, invited me to come down and spend an afternoon at their education center. And they'd set up in their bargaining a provision that their shop stewards would get a sabbatical every few years during the summer, and they would go to this union summer camp, bringing the wives and children. It wasn't intended that the wife should be left behind, or in some cases that the husband attend the kids. Everybody was brought into it. And what they did was play war games. They were given things like the 1918-1919 revolution in Germany, or they had to be union leaders in 1932, 1933. I mean, they took the major watersheds in working class history, the major battles and defeats, and they played it. They did intensive study about it. They argued about it. They took different positions. The shop stewards loved it, and it was an amazing. It seemed to be just an amazing educational experience. That's why I think it's so important, not just to read or listen to memoirs from earlier periods, but actually try and get inside them to understand what the possibilities were, which were foreclosed, which were open, what were the material conditions that increased or decreased, militancy, and what forms of organization were necessary in specific periods, particularly in periods where you faced very high levels of organized violence from the right. And I think it'd be very interesting, like in New York City, to take one of the big struggles in the city's either recent history or maybe go back to the great rent strikes at the end of the First World War, and kind of play that as a war game, and see what you can learn from that. Another thing would be this period, the heroic period of the rank and file shop committees, communist shop committees, in 1936 or 37, and then what happened the 2 years after that is the party withdrew support from rank and file leadership. And besides, everybody likes playing games these days. Why not play
We have nothing left.
Emerge has a game of diplomacy going on right now, as a matter of fact. So we're glad that you've told us that war games are productive for left strategy. Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining us. We've got a lot to think about from what you've said tonight. But for everybody watching, thank you for joining us. We hope to do these again in the future. So maybe look for us down the road to hear about updates about the next one of our Emerge teach-ins. So again, Mike, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. Honorary member and comrade of Emerge, always.
Oh, listen, it's a real privilege to talk to you and your comrades, and I happily accept that honorary membership.
There we go.
That's the only reason we did this. All right. Thanks, Mike. Good night, everyone.